Well, remember a couple of weeks ago when I said that 2022 hasn't really been huge for the Neo-Prog? Well, I may have spoken too soon. We've got another one on our hands today, so let's dive into it. Time Machine by Comedy of Errors. So, this was another one of those albums that I was really looking forward to this year, and it dropped and I completely forgot about it. This came out in September, and I made a note to go and listen to it, and I just, it fell off my map. So, yeah, I'm finally getting around to getting into Comedy of Errors. So, for those of you that do not know about Comedy of Errors, they were a neo-prog band back in the 80s that never really put out any actual albums. They got their start in Glasgow, Scotland in 1984 and disbanded when they just couldn't get things going. They couldn't get anything of any kind of substance. They did reform though back in 2011 and put out their first album of Disobey, and it was fine. It had some really good, powerful neo-prog stuff, and then came back in 2013 with Fanfare and Fantasy, which is kind of their big album, the one that really took the world by storm. My favorite though is I think what a lot of people would say is kind of their weakest album, or one of their weaker albums, of Spirit. I love this album. It's essentially one track of this Spirit motif, and this is the best iteration of the band. I think this is the best way that the band could bring their music forward. And then in 2017, House of the Mind came out, and it was a little bit lackluster for me. I didn't really enjoy it all that much. It just felt like a little bit of a step down after Spirit. So coming into Time Machine, their 2022 release, we've got 5 years since House of the Mind. So yeah, I was excited for some new stuff from Comedy of Errors. And it starts off very, very well. The Night Returns starts off this album, and this album really is just kind of more good music from a neo-prog band. There's nothing really on here for me that like blows down the doors and like really grabs you and it's like, you gotta pay attention to this. But in terms of like the neo-prog stuff, you're gonna have your appetites very well whetted. Now, from the site that I found information about this album, it does seem as though John Fitzgerald on bass and guitars isn't on this album, and he was the main driving force for the bass. It looks like everybody else has returned. Joe Kearney on vocals, Sam McCulloch on guitars, Mark Spalding on guitars, Jim Johnson on keyboards, and Bruce Livick on drums. And you can kind of feel a little bit, and this is just me parsing out with the information that I have, of the lack of that bass, that really rooted bass work that's on here. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just something that I noticed when I was coming into this album. Joe Kearney's vocal works is as strong as ever. He's really able to channel and really breathe forth that style of like neo-prog without going too theatrical, without getting too melodramatic, but he is still able to distill and channel the neo-prog voice, if you know what I mean. The guitar works from Sam and Mark are really, really good. There's not really a passage on here that really makes me salivate, that really makes me come back to. It doesn't really necessarily blow down the doors, but it always makes me interested and always kind of perks my ears a little bit. I will say that Jim Johnson's keyboard works are still stand out as always, but I do feel as though some of his sounds that he's using on the keyboards might not necessarily be the best. Like there's a few moments on here that I feel like he's playing those Yamaha like really dollar bin discount keyboards that have like the preset sounds on there. 9 times out of 10, it feels like he's just choosing a soundscape very willy-nilly and doesn't quite know how to utilize those sounds properly. Especially there's a track on here that utilizes what's supposed to be like a big brass section, like horns and trumpets, and it just feels like a video game sound effect rather than an actual instrumental piece. And it kind of takes me out of it a little bit. It sounds like a band that is just kind of getting their feet wet and they don't have the proper finances to really put into the investments of their instruments in, rather than a band that's been around for over 30 years. So I was drawn back a little bit from that. Now, still saying that Jim is still able to command the keyboards and he's able to produce a really beautiful soundscapes within his keyboard works in terms of like really fast note playing, creating really tasty riffs and jam sessions, but I think some of the sound selections that he chosen might not necessarily be the best. And that's really the only kind of criticisms that I have on here. I've already talked a little bit about The Knight's Return, at how it starts off very energetic, very lively. It hooks you right from the beginning. Classic neo-prog in that scape. Lost Demigods kind of continues this, but slows it down a little bit. You have a lot more of that chugging aspect. It's a lot more bouncy in that case, but it's still got that darkness on it. It's not necessarily a highlight for me. It isn't until we get into the third track of Wonderland, the longest track at 15 and a half minutes long, that we have a little bit more of this ebb and flow. We have a little bit more of this give and take. I love how they're able to set up and pay off a track. This is why I kept coming back to Spirit back in 2015, because of the longer stretches of music. And this is really where that band shines. They're really able to put down a motif, put down a concept, and then have it pay off later on. And I love the storyline. We're talking about Alice in Wonderland and all that whimsical aspect of it, and not being able to make sense of things, and everything being up in the air and being very lost in the madness of it all. I will say, though, I think my favorite track off of this entire album is actually the shortest track of The Past of Future Days. I don't know, there's something about this track that I thoroughly, thoroughly love. I love the orchestration of this. I love the composition of this track. It's so beautiful in this case. Like, this was one of the things that I loved about Spirit, even though one of the things that made me come to this band is their playing between the guitars and the keyboards and the meaty licks and the playouts in that case. But the thing that made me stay was these smaller moments, these more heartfelt moments, the ones that have the band connect with their audience on such a deep, deep scale. And I do feel as though The Past of Future Days does that, and it does it very, very well. And it's also good that it's sandwiched between the two big tracks. The album proper ends with the title track of The Time Machine at 12 minutes and 21 seconds. And it has a very nice play out. But I do feel as though the title track showcases both the best parts of the band and the worst parts of the band. The best parts is that they're really so good at building up a track, and even though this track is 12 minutes long, they spend the first 4 or 5 minutes building this track up and getting that momentum for the mid piece. And when we get to that mid piece, it just kind of explodes in that neo-prog delicious aspect, with the guitars and the keyboards playing back and forth and dueling one another very, very beautifully. But this track also tends to be a little bit more on the melodramatic points. It does showcase some of those more cringe-worthy soundscapes that we have on the keyboards. Like, this is one of the tracks where it's supposed to be this big grand sound, and it just feels like a Yamaha keyboard that has a preset amount of sounds on it. And it does kind of soften the blow that should have been a very emotionally charged track. So yeah, I mean, this album and this track ends with a little bit of a cringeworthy whimper rather than the good build and payoff that I was really hoping for, that big explosion at the end. But I mean, this album overall is still a really good time. I don't want to say that it's not worth your time at all. If you're a fan of neo-prog, you're really going to love this one. And if you're new to the genre, this is a fine place to start. The album itself ends on Disobey, a live rendition of one of their tracks from before, and it's fine. It's fine. It's a nice little pad to the album overall, but at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure if it's completely needed, but it's a nice little bonus track at the end. And yeah, so I will say at the end of the day that Time Machine from Comedy of Errors was a good treat. It's definitely not in the same boathouse that I would put Fanfare and Fantasy or Spirit, but it is a really good next step after the House of the Mind. I think this kind of plays hand in hand with that. For the final rating, I will say that Time Machine from Comedy of Errors is still one that I would stream. This is one that I would recommend checking out. It's not one that I'm going to come back to time and time again like I do Spirit or Fantasy and Fanfare. Or sorry, Fanfare and Fantasy. I always get those too confused. But it is a good next album from Comedy of Errors. It's not one that I was just like, ugh, no. But it definitely wasn't one that I was just like, ooh, yeah, I need more of that. So, yeah, that's what I've got. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. I think that's all I've got for you guys today. So, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.